Story 1. The Carrot Counterfeit Scandal of 1953. In the early spring of 1953, in the quiet farming towns of southern Illinois, the locals were obsessed with something as humble as it was vital: carrots. Post-war America was hungry, rebuilding and reshaping itself into a land of supermarkets and frozen food aisles. But before the neat plastic bags of pre-washed baby carrots and the tidy packaging of supermarket shelves, carrots were bought in bulk, straight from farmers and distributors who traded in cash, handshakes, and trust. It was in this environment of simple business and trust that one of the strangest, most quietly devastating counterfeit scandals in American agricultural history unfolded. A crime that never made the headlines of New York or Lowe's Angels, yet shook the trust of farming communities and exposed vulnerabilities in an industry that, until then, had never considered itself a target for organized fraud. You might wonder, carrots, why would anyone bother counterfeiting something so mundane, so perishable? The answer lies in the peculiar economy of agricultural distribution in the 1950s, a system ripe for exploitation. A farming boom and its shadows. The early 50s were a golden age for American agriculture. Government subsidies, mechanization, and booming demand created fertile ground for both prosperity and crime. Carrots, like many crops, had become big business. Distributors signed contracts worth thousands of dollars to deliver produce to canning factories, military commissaries, and city markets. Cash flowed in, and most of it moved through the hands of middlemen, produce brokers. This was where the cracks appeared. Unlike banks or industrial suppliers, produce brokers were often loosely regulated. Contracts were written quickly, based on trust, reputation, or a single handshake in a dusty office above a grain elevator. Into this informal but lucrative world stepped a small group of fraudsters, armed not with weapons, but with fake invoices, doctored ledgers, and crates that looked full but weren't. The first complaints. It began innocently enough. In May of 1953, canning companies in Springfield and Peoria complained that carrot shipments arriving by freight train were not what they paid for. Crates marked Grade A fresh carrots turned out to contain rotting, undersized produce. Some were half filled with straw to give the illusion of weight. Others bore counterfeit inspection stamps, mimicking those of legitimate agricultural inspectors. At first, these cases were chalked up to negligence or poor storage. Produce spoiled, it was the nature of the business. But when multiple complaints surfaced across several counties, all pointing to the same brokers, suspicion hardened into something darker. By July, law enforcement and agricultural officials realized that this wasn't carelessness. It was a scheme. Someone was systematically counterfeiting produce shipments, falsifying records, and pocketing the profits. Following the paper trail. What made this scandal so unusual was that it wasn't about stealing goods, it was about manipulating trust. Farmers were honest men. They delivered their crops. Brokers were supposed to ensure they reached buyers. But in the carrot counterfeit scandal, the brokers were the very ones orchestrating the fraud. Investigators soon uncovered a web of falsified bills of lading, forged quality inspection slips, and even counterfeit railroad documents. A single crate of carrots might be sold on paper 3 or 4 times to different buyers, with only one shipment ever leaving the warehouse. The rest was fiction, conjured up by typewriters and rubber stamps. This wasn't petty theft. It was organized deception, and it left dozens of small farmers unpaid, while large buyers absorbed losses they couldn't easily trace back. The human cost. Behind the paperwork were people, farmers like the Wilson family in Christian County, who had shipped 12 tons of carrots that spring, only to be told by their broker that the shipment had spoiled in transit and was unsellable. They received nothing in return. The Wilsons nearly lost their farm. Canning plant workers were furloughed when shipments never arrived. Railroad inspectors were accused of negligence when doctored papers were discovered. In small towns where everyone knew everyone, suspicion spread like wildfire. Who was behind it? How could they do this without someone noticing? A quiet but devastating crime. The Carrot Counterfeit Scandal never carried the violence of gangland shootings or the drama of a jewel heist. Instead, it was a crime of quiet devastation, ruined livelihoods, broken trust, and a creeping awareness that even the most ordinary transactions could be corrupted. It was also, in many ways, a forgotten crime, overshadowed by larger scandals of its era: the McCarthy hearings, organized crime investigations, and Cold War espionage. The Carrot Counterfeiters left behind only faint traces in newspaper archives and agricultural reports. Yet for those who lived it, the scandal was unforgettable. And so the question lingers: who masterminded the scheme and how far did it reach? The summer of 1953 was unusually dry in central Illinois. Dust clung to every surface, coated tractor wheels, and settled into the creases of ledgers and farm hats alike. But behind the cracked earth and whispering cornfields, something more sinister had taken root, one far less visible than a drought. The counterfeit carrot operation wasn't just a scheme of opportunistic deception. It was something more intricate, more deliberate. In Section 1, we scratched the surface. Now, the investigation deepens, and so does the mystery. The unsung detectives, the Illinois Department of Agriculture. When farmers and buyers began lodging formal complaints, it wasn't local police who took the lead. It was the compliance unit of the Illinois Department of Agriculture, IDA. A quiet office based in Springfield, the IDA rarely found itself investigating criminal conspiracies. Its typical caseload included mislabeled fertilizer, pest infestation violations, or disputes over grain storage. But this was different. This was criminal fraud conducted under the guise of everyday commerce. The investigation was led by Inspector Helen Marchand, one of the first women appointed to a senior investigative role at the IDA. She was methodical, sharp-eyed, and deeply respected by farmers throughout the region. She wasn't flashy. Her tools were not a badge and revolver, but a clipboard, magnifying glass, and deep knowledge of agricultural paperwork. Marchand's first clue came from a subtle inconsistency in a quality inspection stamp. The signature that shouldn't exist. At the heart of the scandal was a counterfeit USDA-grade sticker. All produced shipments, particularly those headed to federal buyers or crossing state lines, required USDA inspection. These stickers included a signature from a certified inspector, a printed code, and an embossed seal. When Marchand compared inspection records with the crates received by Peoria Canning Co., she found that Inspector R.G. Thornton had supposedly approved dozens of shipments across a 6-week span. But Thornton, as it turned out, had died in March of 1953, 2 months before the dates on the shipments he allegedly inspected. Forgery. But it wasn't just one document. There were dozens, all featuring Thornton's name, each slightly different in signature style. Marchand's team identified them as traced, printed, or copied signatures, some so crudely done that magnification revealed carbon paper marks. The forgeries were rushed, but effective enough to pass under the radar of shipping clerks and small-time buyers. Only straw on the bottom. Simultaneously, agricultural freight inspectors at St. Louis Union Station were noticing something odd about specific boxcar shipments. They seemed lighter than expected. According to bills of lading, a single train car of carrots should weigh nearly 30,000 pounds. Yet scales indicated the cars were underweight by nearly a third. Curious, a freight supervisor ordered a random inspection. What he found confirmed Marchand's suspicions. The top half of each crate contained real carrots, dense, fresh, full-sized. The bottom half was nothing but wood shavings, straw, and in some cases, wet newspapers wrapped in burlap. The fraud was deliberate. The weight had been artificially inflated by soaking straw in water. The top layer fooled most visual inspections. If no one dug deep or if unloading was done hastily, the deception passed unnoticed. It was a stunningly simple con. Enter the middleman, Caleb Wint. In August, the IDA turned its attention to a name that kept appearing on shipping manifests. Caleb Wint, a produce broker with operations in Effingham and Carbondale. Wint was, on paper, a minor figure. He didn't own farms or factories. He connected buyers and sellers, took a small commission, and arranged logistics. But Wint was no ordinary middleman. His records were immaculate too immaculate. While other brokers kept handwritten invoices and carbon copies, Wint's paperwork was typeset, filed, and even alphabetized. The problem was, many of the names on his invoices either couldn't be traced to real farms, or the listed addresses led to vacant lots or abandoned barns. Investigators began to suspect Wint was laundering fake transactions, creating phantom farms to ship produce that never existed. It was estimated that between March and July of 1953, over $320,000 in fraudulent carrot shipments moved through Wint's network, over $3 million in today's dollars. No one really checks carrots. Interviewed years later by a retired agricultural investigator, an unnamed source who had worked with Wint revealed a chilling truth. We never thought we'd get caught. No one really checks carrots. You fill a few crates, pay a guy with a truck, stamp a few slips, and everyone assumes it's real. Hell, most buyers don't even see the shipment, just the invoice. Carrots weren't cocaine or diamonds. They were invisible. It was, in a way, the perfect crime. The very mundanity of the product became the cloak of concealment. The National Freight Loop. By late August, Marchand traced the scheme beyond Illinois. Similar counterfeit crates were showing up in Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, and even as far as Nebraska. The same forged inspection stamps, the same underweight boxcars, the same broker names. It wasn't just Caleb Wint, it was a network. The operation depended on timing. Wint and his counterparts exploited the loop freight system, a strategy where boxcars carrying produce west would return east with meat or grain. During transitions, produce brokers often refilled empty cars, routing them through lesser-inspected depots. If one boxcar vanished or arrived light, the delay or discrepancy would be blamed on the freight company, not fraud. In short, the system was too chaotic to notice. Until someone did. A broken supply chain. As more shipments failed inspection or arrived late, buyers began backing out of contracts. Small-town canneries laid off workers. School lunch programs dependent on bulk vegetable contracts switched suppliers. Local economies suffered in slow, grinding ways. The Illinois Farming Bureau estimated over 45 independent carrot farms reported financial losses due to fraudulent shipment issues. Some, like the Wilsons mentioned earlier, never recovered. Then in early September, an incident shattered the quiet momentum of the case. The disappearance of Gregory Moxley. Gregory Moxley, a former warehouse clerk turned whistleblower, was scheduled to testify in a closed-door hearing with IDA officials. Moxley had worked briefly under Wint's brokerage firm and claimed he had proof of falsified warehouse entries and fake inspection tags. He never made the meeting. His car was found abandoned on a dirt road 20 miles west of Mount Vernon. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints. Inside the glove compartment, a folder marked Shipment 627/714 and a half-burned notebook. The folder was empty. To this day, Moxley's fate remains unclear. Some believe he fled the state under threat. Others insist he was silenced. Officially, he is listed as a missing person, and his case remains open. Mounting pressure, mounting denials. With Wint facing increasing scrutiny, he went on the defensive. He denied wrongdoing, insisting he was being made a scapegoat for a broken system. He blamed rail delays, poor storage, and even the farmers themselves for shipping questionable goods. But Marchand wasn't buying it. By September's end, She had accumulated over 70 pages of direct evidence, including duplicate invoices, freight weight discrepancies, and matching serial numbers across allegedly different shipments. Still, the question lingered: where were the profits going? Wint lived modestly, no cars, no real estate, no visible luxury. Was he just the front? If so, who was behind him? The rumor of Box 9. One final clue came from a grain inspector in Decatur, who tipped off investigators to a whispered term in freight circles: Box 9. Allegedly, it was a rotating freight car used to ferry extra cargo, often unlisted, sometimes fake. The car's ID number was frequently altered with chalk or tape, and it moved along Midwestern lines, always just out of reach. Box 9, according to whispered accounts, was the heart of the fraud, a mobile staging ground for crate swapping, relabeling, and dumping. To find Box 9 would be to unravel the entire scheme. But no one knew where it was. Not yet. By late autumn of 1953, the Carrot Counterfeit Scandal had grown from a quiet nuisance into a slow-boiling crisis for farmers, buyers, and regulators alike. But despite mounting evidence, reams of forged invoices, and one missing warehouse clerk, the perpetrators had evaded arrest. The crime had no clear fingerprints, no blood, no gun, no single smoking gun, just a trail of empty crates, doctored records, and lives quietly crumbling in the dust of forgotten rural towns. Yet even in the stillest waters, something stirs beneath the surface. And for Inspector Helen Marchand, the key to this scandal's unraveling was something as peculiar as its premise: a freight car no one could seem to pin down. A ghost on the tracks. Box 9 had become more than a freight car. It was folklore among freight inspectors, whispered over diner counters and loading docks. It wasn't listed in the regular inventory of the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad, C&EI. Yet its markings had been spotted by workers in Terre Haute, Decatur, St. Louis, and Paducah. Each time it surfaced, it had a different stenciled serial, but freight workers knew it by a small, hand-carved notch in its side panel, a kind of signature only seasoned railroad men would notice. What made Box 9 special wasn't its invisibility, it was its mobility. It seemed to vanish from manifests, appear suddenly on side rails, and carry undocumented crates filled with, in theory, anything. The final clue that broke the case open came from an unlikely source: a 17-year-old freight apprentice named Wendell Rice, who worked night shifts on the Springfield line. Wendell's discovery. One evening in mid-October, Wendell was tasked with checking seals on idle freight cars outside Mount Pulaski, a sleepy junction known more for grain than mystery. As he walked the line with a lantern, he noticed a familiar-looking car tucked between two cattle carriers. A barely visible etching on the metal door caught his eye: BX9. Curious, he noted the serial number and reported it to his supervisor, who brushed it off as irrelevant. But Wendell, intrigued by talk of Box 9 among the older workers, scribbled the number in his notebook. That number, CEIX 201,456, was later cross-referenced by Helen Marchand's office. It didn't exist in any official database, yet its inspection date was marked only a week prior in St. Louis, approved by none other than the deceased, R.G. Thornton. They had found Box 9. Operation Root Rot. With the cooperation of the C&EI and under pressure from the governor's office, Marchand initiated Operation Root Rot, a coordinated sting operation designed to intercept Box 9 in its next movement. Railway logistics teams were instructed to track the rogue car, while Marchand prepared a small surveillance unit of 3 agents armed not with weapons, but cameras, bolt cutters, and warrants. On November 3, 1953, Box 9 resurfaced in a side yard outside Vandalia, Illinois. The agents moved in. Inside, they found exactly what Marchand had anticipated and more. The contents of Box 9: 42 crates, each marked grade A carrots, were stacked in precise formation. But upon opening them, agents discovered layers of rotted produce, soaked straw, and in some cases, cardboard tubes filled with sand. Most damningly, in one crate hidden beneath false bottom panels, they found a portable typewriter, several forged USDA stamped templates, rolls of fake labels, and a briefcase stuffed with signed blank bills of lading. It was effectively a mobile forgery lab. The freight car itself had been modified hidden compartments, false walls, even a pulley system designed to shift crates mid-transit. Whoever was running this had put in months of planning and thousands of dollars. Now they had evidence. The arrest of Caleb Wint. 3 days later, authorities arrested Caleb Wint at a roadside diner outside Carbondale. He was alone, eating a ham sandwich and reading the sports page. He offered no resistance. Under questioning, Wint refused to confess. But as agents revealed the evidence from Box 9, particularly the stamps and signed documents, his silence deepened. In an attempt to deflect, he offered a single name, Dorian Crail. A man, he claimed, who was the real architect of the operation. The problem: no one named Dorian Crail appeared in state or federal business records. Wint had invented a phantom. Or had he? The ghost broker. Investigators dug through old produce auction records and discovered that D. Crail and Associates had briefly operated out of a warehouse in Paducah, Kentucky, during the spring of 1952 before disappearing without a trace. Local clerks recalled a quiet man in gray who paid in cash, drove a black Studebaker, and refused to be photographed. Could Wint have been working under someone else? Or had he simply created Crail as a legal decoy? The truth, like much of this case, was slippery. Crail became a ghost in the record, a symbol of either conspiracy or scapegoating. The trial that almost was. In February 1954, Wint was indicted on 8 counts of interstate fraud, 3 counts of document forgery, and 2 counts of conspiracy to defraud agricultural institutions. But his trial never happened. 3 weeks before the first hearing, Wint suffered what was officially declared a heart attack in his jail cell. The coroner reported natural causes. No foul play was suspected. But many, including Marchand, were unconvinced. There were rumors that he was silenced, that he had a deal go bad, that Crail, if real, had a longer reach than anyone assumed. No autopsy was ever performed. Wint took the full truth to his grave. The fallout. The Carrot Counterfeit Scandal left deep scars. Over $500,000 in fraudulent transactions were traced. 12 farms closed permanently. Several small-town canneries failed to recover. In the wake of the scandal, new regulations were introduced in Illinois and neighboring states requiring stricter record-keeping, certified freight tracking numbers, and independent third-party inspections for bulk produce shipments. The USDA adopted similar changes nationwide by 1955. Inspector Helen Marchand was awarded the Governor's Medal for Service and quietly retired in 1956. Her handwritten case files, preserved in state archives, are still used as training material for agricultural fraud units. The legacy of an unusual crime. You may never have heard of the Carrot Counterfeit Scandal. It was never adapted into a film, never made it into a big city courtroom drama. But it stands as a peculiar, almost poetic example of how crime doesn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears a tie, stamps a form, and ships out vegetables. It proved that no system, not even something as plain as produce logistics, is immune to exploitation. And Box 9, it was dismantled, its parts sold off, its memory turned into freight yard legend. But one question remains. Who was Dorian Crail, if he ever existed at all? Story 2. The Post Office Poisoner, Chicago, 1921. The morning air over Chicago's South Loop was already thick with coal smoke by the time Postmaster Lyle Bromley began his daily routine on January 12, 1921. Outside, ice clung to streetcar rails and window panes like barnacles. Inside the Adams Street Postal Depot, everything smelled of aged paper and wax-sealed glue. That morning's mail intake had come in heavy. Over 3,000 parcels moved through the sorting line before noon. Some were bound for the Gold Coast mansions of Astor Street, others for the Polish flats of Pilsen. Most would arrive as expected. But parcel number 1147 would not. It would vanish for nearly 48 hours, and when it finally surfaced, it would leave a trail of questions, a corpse, and one of the strangest true crime mysteries ever buried in the backrooms of the United States Postal Service. The first sign, a dead clerk. Victor Carmichael, 27, was a night shift clerk at the Adams Street Post Office, a reliable man, rarely late, known for his collection of novelty cufflinks and deep affection for grapefruit slices soaked in gin. On the night of January 13th, Victor reported for his 10 p.m. shift, feeling well enough to joke with coworkers. Around 2:15 a.m., he began sweating profusely, clutching his stomach. He collapsed near the parcel intake bins, convulsing violently. Despite efforts to revive him, Carmichael was declared dead by 3:10 a.m. His symptoms were baffling. No history of illness, no wounds or external trauma. Initial assessments pointed to acute food poisoning, perhaps from spoiled fruit. But Dr. Lionel Greeley, the attending coroner, noted something odd. Carmichael's mouth bore faint chemical burns, and his fingertips were slightly blistered. Blood tests, rudimentary by modern standards, hinted at the presence of oxalic acid and possibly arsenic trioxide, two substances not found in everyday life but common in early 20th century poisons. An untraceable package. 2 hours after Carmichael's death, a supervisor discovered an unusual parcel buried beneath rejected shipments. It was wrapped in brown butcher paper, tightly twine-bound, with a forged customs declaration claiming perfumed soaps, the shipping address, a boarding house on Archer Avenue, the return address, a closed dry goods shop in Pittsburgh. But what truly stood out was the weight. The package was listed at 2 pounds but weighed only 8 ounces. And inside, nothing but shredded wool, broken glass, and a folded card that read simply, "Happy Retirement, Lyle." No soap, no scent, no sender. And no one knew how it got into the depot in the first place. The letter room tapes. Though surveillance, as we know it, didn't exist in 1921, large post offices like Adams Street were equipped with letter room stenographer logs, a system of rotating clerks assigned to record notable package entries, serials, and weights for auditing purposes. Cross-referencing logs from January 12th and 13th, an anomaly was found. Parcel number 1147 had been logged in twice, 11 minutes apart, with 2 different weights, both scribbled by the same clerk but in wildly different handwriting. One entry even appeared in red ink, an unusual deviation from the required black. The package had also been misrouted. Instead of heading for outbound sorting, it had somehow looped back into internal delivery, a rare occurrence unless someone manually retagged it. The implication was clear. The parcel had been intercepted and altered inside the depot. A poison in the air. The autopsy on Carmichael confirmed it. Death by arsenic inhalation, with secondary ingestion likely due to contaminated fingertips. Investigators theorized that, upon handling parcel number 1147, Carmichael had unknowingly opened a booby-trapped box laced with a powdered chemical compound. Either through breathing or through contact with residual dust, he had absorbed a lethal dose. But then came the troubling part. Parcel number 1147 wasn't addressed to him. It was clearly meant for Postmaster Lyle Bromley, the very man whose name appeared on the cryptic retirement card inside the box. A man worth killing. Lyle Bromley had been with the Postal Service for 34 years. A Civil War veteran's son, he was known for his rigid discipline, passion for clockwork precision, and absolute intolerance for corruption. He had never married, lived alone in a rented flat above a bicycle shop, and spent Sundays attending silent films at the Jackson Park Nickelodeon. By all accounts, he had no enemies, except perhaps one. In 1919, Bromley led an internal campaign to expose a ring of mail theft conspirators operating from the Chicago depot's night shift. 3 clerks were indicted, and one was sentenced to 5 years at Joliet Prison. That man's name, Kenneth Dorrance, and he had been released just 3 weeks before Carmichael's death. The Dorrance angle. Kenneth Dorrance had once been a promising postal clerk quick with numbers, fluent in German, and known for his calligraphy. But he had also embezzled over $800 worth of registered mail payments and was caught forging cancellation stamps on war bonds. Upon release from prison in late December 1920, he disappeared. No family, no known residence, no job. But 2 days before Carmichael's death, a man matching Dorrance's description was seen lingering near the Adams Street depot, pretending to sell pencils to commuters. When questioned by investigators later, witnesses described him as nervous, pale, and always watching the door. A citywide bulletin was issued for Dorrance's arrest. He was never found. A second parcel surfaces. Just when the investigation seemed to hit a dead end, a nearly identical parcel appeared at the Grand Central Post Office, 5 miles north. This package, postmarked a day after parcel 1147, was intercepted due to suspicious leakage. It bore the same false return address in Pittsburgh, the same brown wrapping, and the same weight discrepancy. Inside, glass shards, wool insulation, and another folded card. This one read, "Congratulations on your promotion, Henry." There was no recipient listed. The package was labeled undeliverable and shelved until word of the Adams Street incident connected the two. Henry, investigators would later determine, referred to Henry Murn, a postal fraud examiner newly promoted in December, another official involved in the 1919 embezzlement crackdown. A pattern in powder. With 2 near-identical parcels and a vanished suspect, the theory evolved. Dorrance had created a series of targeted poison packages, each crafted as symbolic gifts for those who helped put him behind bars. Using knowledge of internal routing protocols, he exploited weak points in the manual sorting process. He knew where to plant parcels when they'd be processed and who might touch them. Carmichael's death, then, was likely collateral damage, a tragic accident resulting from Dorrance's inability to control exactly who opened the trap. But the poison, carefully milled, powdered arsenic suggested more than revenge. It suggested planning, patience, and an intent to kill without detection. So why stop at 2 parcels? The unopened drawer. One final twist came from a forgotten drawer in the depot's dead letter office. Weeks after the incidents, an elderly clerk named Martha Penwhistle reported a foul smell coming from a locked cabinet used for misrouted or unclaimed mail. Inside, she found an undelivered parcel, marked again with the Pittsburgh dry goods return address. This one was destined for a P.O. box in Milwaukee, registered to one G.H. Croft, a name later confirmed as an alias used by Bromley during a covert investigation in 1919. The card inside this parcel. "You thought you got away clean." Postal silence. The post office never made public the full details of the parcel poisoner investigation. Internal memos from 1921-1922 remain partially redacted in National Archives. What is known is this. The parcels stopped. Kenneth Dorrance was never found. The Chicago Postal Department quietly reassigned over 40 employees within 18 months. Lyle Bromley retired abruptly in August 1921, relocating to Boise, Idaho, under an assumed name. A short obituary published in 1938 listed no next of kin. And the final question remains: did Kenneth Dorrance really disappear, or did someone else, somewhere down the line, return the parcel? In the days following the discovery of the third poison parcel tucked inside a forgotten drawer in the Adams Street dead letter cabinet, tensions inside the Chicago postal system reached a quiet but palpable breaking point. Supervisors whispered about sabotage. Clerks checked packages twice. Inspectors from Washington, D.C. arrived under the guise of procedural audits, but everyone knew this wasn't about misfiled letters. This was about a killer who had worked among them, and more terrifyingly, someone who knew their system better than they did. Inside the mind of a clerk, Kenneth Dorrance wasn't a brute or a lunatic. His crime in 1919, mail theft and forgery, was deliberate, clean, and paper-bound. According to transcripts from his disciplinary hearings, Dorrance showed no remorse. He didn't deny his actions. Instead, he defended them with cold logic. When a system makes no effort to notice its own bleeding, it deserves the hemorrhage. That quote, scribbled in pencil during a hearing, resurfaced as investigators in 1921 tried to reconstruct his potential movements. If Dorrance was indeed the post office poisoner, he hadn't simply mailed toxic boxes from alley mailboxes or suburban branches. He had infiltrated the internal flow, the spine of the postal system. That meant he had help, or, at the very least, he had insider access. This wasn't just personal revenge. This was architectural subversion. The quiet night routes. Between midnight and 6 a.m., the Chicago depot moved more parcels than at any other time. Mail trains arrived from Detroit, St. Paul, and Cincinnati, offloading thousands of packages that were quickly resorted, stamped, and redirected to morning carriers. It was during these unregulated night hours that most anomalies occurred. Records from January 10-14, 1921, revealed something subtle. During 3 consecutive nights, multiple unassigned route tags had been logged. These were routing slips usually generated by clerks for overflow mail when standard bins were full. But someone, likely the poisoner, had been using them to create phantom routes. The result: parcels like number 1147 moved erratically through the system, never truly leaving, circling endlessly until the right hands opened them. To accomplish this required one of 2 things: a current employee manipulating internal sorting procedures, or an ex-employee who still had keys, knowledge, and a uniform left behind. On January 21st, just over a week after Carmichael's death, cleaning staff discovered a torn postal clerk's overcoat beneath a storage bench in the disused east wing of the depot. Inside its breast pocket, a folded copy of the Chicago Tribune, dated January 10th, a brass name pin, DCORNELL, and most chillingly, a small glass vial empty, labeled with only the letters as 203, the chemical symbol for arsenic trioxide. The name pin, when run through employee records, revealed no D. Cornell on staff, but hand-dinked employment cards from 1918 showed a Kenneth D. Cornell, a known alias of Dorrance used during a 6-month assignment in Gary, Indiana. Even more telling, the code had not been issued by the Chicago branch. It bore a serial from the St. Louis depot. Had Dorrance stolen the uniform, or had someone from another city helped him gain access? The St. Louis link. St. Louis officials were contacted discreetly. Their response was curt and careful. Yes, they confirmed several uniforms had gone missing in December 1920 after a warehouse break-in. They had no suspects. But an internal memo, never publicly released, revealed that in late December, a postal inspector in St. Louis reported an unidentified man wandering inside a freight distribution hallway, flashing a stolen badge and redirecting a cart of parcels. By the time the man was challenged, he had vanished into the crowd. Sketches matched Dorrance's 1919 intake photos, slightly older, a bit gaunt, but unmistakable. This man hadn't simply gone underground. He was testing vulnerability across multiple cities. And now, it seemed, he was using those lessons in Chicago. The press gets wind. Despite the post office's best efforts to contain the scandal, on February 4th, 1921, the Chicago Herald-Examiner published a sensational headline: "Murder by Mail, Postal Clerk Poisoned by Parcel Bomb." The piece, though short on facts, exposed enough to panic the public. It claimed that toxic powder had been found in the city's main post office and hinted at multiple death plots against government employees. Within 24 hours, over 60 post offices across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin were forced to halt parcel intake, pending inspections. Many small-town branches refused to accept packages over £1. At the Adams Street Depot, 24 workers staged a walkout, demanding better security and non-toxic work conditions. Suddenly, what had been a quiet internal matter became a regional crisis. And Dorrance, wherever he was, had succeeded in sowing chaos. An accidental witness. On February 6th, a postal janitor named Eugene Collies stepped forward. Nervous and unsure of what he had seen, he told investigators about a stranger he had encountered 3 weeks earlier in a dimly lit hallway behind the depot's sorting belt. The man wore a regulation coat, but Collies noted 2 oddities. He was not wearing a badge, a serious violation. And he spoke with a faint southern accent, possibly Missouri or Kentucky. The man had asked where to find the Croft locker, a reference Collies didn't understand at the time. Now he realized Croft was the false name on the 3rd parcel. Investigators showed Collies several photographs. He identified Dorrance immediately. The pieces were falling into place, but still, they lacked a way to catch him in the act. The bait parcel. Desperate for a lead, Inspector Elmer Tallwright, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator from D.C., proposed an idea: use Dorrance's method against him. Create a parcel, label it with one of the known fake return addresses, mark it for one of the people Dorrance had threatened before, plant it inside the Adams Street Depot, then wait. If Dorrance was still accessing the building, he'd take the bait. On February 9th, a dummy parcel was created. Inside was a hollowed wooden crate lined with soot-activated fingerprint film. Hidden inside was a pocket camera shutter rigged to activate on lid movement. The parcel was placed near the freight cages at 2:10 a.m. At 3:42 a.m. it vanished. The photo that almost caught a killer. The camera shutter caught only half a face, but it was enough. A blurred image of a man's chin, part of a nose, and a distinct mole near the jawline. Side-by-side comparisons with Dorrance's prison mugshot yielded an 87% match, inconclusive by modern standards, but enough to move forward in 1921. Every train station and post office between Chicago and St. Louis was put on alert. But again, no arrest was ever made. The final lead. In May 1921, the trail went cold. No new parcels, no sightings, no unusual activity. Until one final report. A boarding house landlady in Evansville, Indiana, contacted authorities after a guest named Mr. Donald Kent left suddenly, leaving behind a suitcase. Inside, inspectors found traces of arsenic dust, cut rubber gloves, 2 partially completed parcel tags, a list of names and addresses. At the top, L. Bromley, Rhett, Boise, ID. H. Murnau, Chicago. E. Tallwright, D.C. And last, curiously, Kay Dorrance dead. The suitcase was burned, the room sterilized. The man had vanished. Legacy of the poisoner. The postal system changed forever after the events of 1921. All internal parcels were required to be logged by 2 clerks, not 1. Uniforms and badges became serialized and tracked. A new department, the Postal Inspection Chemical Hazard Division, was founded in 1922. The official records list Kenneth Dorrance as missing, presumed dead. But some believe the final line in that suitcase list meant more. That Dorrance, having finished his mission or perhaps realizing the walls were closing and erased himself one last time. Whether that meant death or reinvention, we may never know. But when you drop off a package today, you can thank a forgotten clerk named Victor Carmichael and the poison he never saw coming for the safety you now take for granted. By the early summer of 1921, the story of the post office poisoner had faded from newspaper headlines, overtaken by stories of the Tulsa race massacre's aftermath, economic rebounds, and the new President Harding's rail plans. But inside the United States Postal Service, the aftershocks continued. Quiet reorganizations, forced retirements, interdepartmental friction all rippled out from Chicago like contamination in a water line. While the public went about mailing packages and buying 2-cent stamps, a small circle of investigators and surviving victims remained obsessed with a name that no longer existed on any registry: Kenneth Dorrance. No body, no trial, no closure. Only a box of clues, a string of poison-laced parcels, and a single nagging question. Why didn't he finish the job? The ghost that didn't return. Despite the ominous list found in the suitcase in Evansville, no further parcels were ever intercepted. Postal Inspector Elmer Tallwright remained unharmed. So did Henry Murnau in Chicago. Lyle Bromley, the original target, lived quietly in Boise until his death in 1938. His funeral was attended by 2 postal clerks, both in silence, and no known relatives. If Dorrance's final intention was to kill all involved in his conviction, why stop after 3 attempts? Theories abounded. He had died after all, perhaps by suicide, or by his own chemicals. He'd been caught under another name and jailed for an unrelated offense. Or most hauntingly, he had simply lost interest. To answer that, we must look not just at the crimes but the man behind them. Who was Kenneth Dorrance? Born in 1883 in Morris, Illinois, Dorrance was the son of a failed pharmacist and a mother who ran a private school out of their home. He was quiet, observant, fascinated by systems and paper. Teachers described him as meticulous to a fault. His handwriting flourished, and precise was often mistaken for typeset print. By age 17, he had memorized the entire Federal Postal Routing Codebook and began work as a junior clerk in Joliet. His evaluations were glowing, unusually accurate under pressure, displays an intuitive grasp of logistics, would be an ideal candidate for administrative supervision. But he never advanced. His supervisors noted he was socially limited and disliked by coworkers for pedantic behavior. He filed grievances about improper routing code usage, misspelled names, and incorrect uniform shoes. In 1919, when the internal mail theft investigation began, Dorrance had already been pushing internal complaints for over a year. When he discovered others skimming war bond stamps and faking parcel logs, he didn't whistleblow, he joined in. Why? According to one internal note written after his arrest, he didn't steal for wealth. He did it to prove the system could be manipulated better than it was designed. The theory of systems revenge. Dr. Miriam Teller, a criminal behaviorist who reviewed the Dorrance case decades later, proposed a chilling hypothesis. Kenneth Dorrance was not a vengeful man. He was a purist. When he was caught in 1919, it wasn't the punishment that infuriated him. It was the system's failure to recognize his superiority. The parcels were less about killing and more about sending a message. You didn't deserve to win. In other words, Dorrance wasn't just a man getting even, he was executing a message, delivered via the very network he had once worshipped. The quiet closures. After 1921, several figures in the investigation quietly left government work. Henry Myrna resigned in 1923 and moved to Oregon. He opened a stationery shop. Elmer Tallwright transferred to Treasury, abandoning postal work entirely. And Martha Penwhistle, the elderly clerk who found the third parcel, took early retirement and reportedly refused to speak of the incident for the rest of her life. None of them would ever receive another threatening letter or suspicious package. But many believed that Dorrance, if alive, was still watching, waiting. The red stamp. In 1925, a curious item appeared in the postal archives. Misfiled between two budget reports was a small parcel with no wrapping, just a folded envelope containing a single label. A counterfeit routing tag, postmarked from Detroit, reading Number 1147, priority retired. Stamped in red ink. The same red ink used in the falsified logs in Chicago. The envelope bore no prints, no chemical residue, nothing illegal. It had simply been slipped into the archive file deliberately. The staff archivist who found it noted only one thing. This appears to have been hand-placed with the expectation someone would find it, but not immediately, like a time capsule or a wink. The envelope was placed into storage under unresolved incident, internal sabotage. The ironic legacy. In a strange twist of fate, the very scandal that haunted the post office also helped modernize it. Package handling protocols were overhauled nationwide. A precursor to the barcode scanner system was introduced in trial form by 1928. Parcel logs, once handwritten, became typewritten and filed in duplicate. Many of these changes were inspired, at least in part, by the gaps exploited by the poisoner. In a way, Kenneth Dorrance had done what he set out to do. He improved the system. Not through reform, but by terror. A cold case in a warm drawer. In 1976, while cleaning out an old mail vault in the basement of the now decommissioned Adams Street Depot, a postal contractor stumbled upon a dust-covered locker labeled Private, Do Not Purge. Inside were dozens of files marked Case 4421 Dorrance. Among them was a yellowed ledger, handwritten, tracking sightings, known aliases, and suspected movements between 1921 and 1931. The last entry, dated August 7, 1931, noted a possible sighting in Toledo, Ohio, by a retired inspector who swore he saw Dorrance buying stamps at a train station. When confronted, the man allegedly smiled and replied, "Still watching your weight, Elmer." The inspector fainted on the spot. No arrest was made. The station cameras, primitive at the time, had already been taped over due to an unrelated maintenance issue. The ledger ends there. No further activity was recorded. A system too human. Perhaps the greatest irony of the post office poisoner case is how it highlighted the vulnerabilities not just in logistics but in people. The system had been designed with mechanical elegance, but it had failed to anticipate human nature. The desire for control, the need for recognition, the capacity for revenge dressed as reform, and most importantly, the idea that someone could love a system so much that they'd destroy it to make it better. And so we're left with one name, 3 parcels, 1 death, countless shadows, no charges, no answers, no closure. Just a whisper in the basement of American bureaucracy, a story of how something as dull and mundane as a parcel could become a weapon, and how a quiet man with a gift for routing codes became a ghost that rewrote federal policy. So next time you receive a package you didn't order, wrapped neatly, labeled with a return address that doesn't seem quite right, you might wonder, is it still possible that someone, somewhere, is mailing their message one forgotten system at a time? Story 3. The Vanished Bank Ledgers of Aberdeen, 1967. The snow fell lightly on Aberdeen, South Dakota, that morning in early February 1967, blanketing the sidewalks and freezing time in a haze of Midwestern silence. Aberdeen was no one's idea of exciting. Population, just over 20,000. Its economy revolved around rail yards, cattle, and 3 banks, one of which, the Northern Plains Trust and Reserve, would soon become ground zero for one of the strangest, quietest financial crimes in U.S. history. No masked robbers, no vault explosions, no sirens, no car chases. Just an entire set of financial ledgers that vanished without a trace. Along with them, $1.2 million in untraceable assets. And perhaps more chilling than the crime itself, no one noticed for nearly 2 weeks. A small town, a large secret. In 1967, the Northern Plains Trust and Reserve was what bankers called sleepy. It wasn't where you went for investments or exotic portfolios. It was where you opened a joint account when you got married, deposited grain checks in the fall, or took out a mortgage for a prefab home. The bank's president, Ellis Wentz, was a lifelong Aberdeen man. Gray-haired, eagle-nosed, always dressed in brown suits and polished shoes, Wentz had worked at the bank since 1932. He knew every teller by name and could recall which customers paid their debts early, which delayed their payments until the last minute, and which had once bounced checks out of desperation. The ledger's massive, leather-bound books kept in a steel-locked records room were relics of a pre-digital age. Each entry was handwritten in fountain pen, cross-referenced, and triple-initialed. These weren't just records, they were the bank's memory. And then they were gone. Discovery of the absence. The bank's internal auditing team, led by Marjorie Rents, conducted monthly reconciliations using these ledgers. On February 15th, she requested access to the records room to prepare reports for a visiting compliance officer. When she unlocked the door, she found the steel filing drawers hanging open, hollow and silent. No signs of forced entry. No damage. No fingerprints. 6 ledgers were missing, each one covering the last 3 fiscal quarters of 1966. They had simply disappeared. Rents assumed they had been misfiled. Over the next 2 days, every inch of the records vault was searched, then the archive room, then the locked file cabinets in Wentz's office. Nothing. When she informed Wentz, his reaction was unsettling. He didn't seem surprised. A delayed report. Here is where the case takes an odd turn. Instead of contacting local police or state authorities, Wentz informed no one, not the FDIC, not the board, not law enforcement. He claimed the ledgers were likely transferred mistakenly to a regional storage facility in Minneapolis. He sent a single telegram to the records coordinator there. No follow-up, no paperwork. It wasn't until February 28th, nearly 2 full weeks after the disappearance, that Marjorie Rents broke protocol and contacted Detective Neil Swickard, a former military investigator turned Aberdeen PD's financial crimes officer. Swickard, an even-tempered man with a buzz cut and a habit of staring a little too long at people, asked a simple question. Why would someone steal something that can't be sold? He meant the ledgers. To the outside world, they were useless, but to someone who wanted to hide a crime, they were a golden eraser. The money trail that was. Swickard's early investigation uncovered something deeply troubling. With the missing ledgers gone, there was no official record of approximately $1.2 million in personal and agricultural loan activity, almost all of it issued under the bank's Rural Development Initiative. That program started in 1965, provided below-market interest loans to farmers, seed co-ops, and even livestock auctions. The ledger books contained original signatures, terms, payment schedules, and collateral notes. And because microfilming was only used for deposit records, not loan files, there were no duplicates. When Swickard asked Wentz for supporting documents, he was handed a single box of mismatched receipts, many of which were unsigned or showed conflicting payment dates. It was clear, either the loans never existed or they had been deliberately erased. Uncovering the silent borrowers, Swickard began interviewing people who should have been listed in the missing ledgers. Many were confused. A farmer named Earl Tenney swore he had taken a $14,000 loan in mid-1966 to purchase seed drills. He showed Swickard a crumpled receipt but no contract. Another borrower, a widow named Carla Billings, claimed she paid off her 18-month mortgage 2 months early. She had the check stub to prove it. Yet none of their names appeared in any existing bank record. It was as if their debts had never been recorded and their repayments had never been received. Where had the money gone? And then came the most important question. Had it ever existed at all? The vanishing bookkeeper. One employee was conspicuously absent from the chaos. Douglas Lane, the bank's night bookkeeper. He was responsible for transferring all handwritten entries into a secondary summary sheet before the ledgers were stored each week. Lane, 41, lived alone in a rented flat above a barber shop. He was known to be punctual if aloof, and always carried a leather satchel. On February 14th, the day before the ledgers were discovered, missing Lane didn't show up to work. He never returned. A welfare check found his apartment empty but not abandoned. The heat was on. There was food in the refrigerator. A radio softly hummed static. Lane's satchel, however, was gone. So was his typewriter and every carbon copy sheet he was known to use for note-keeping. The only clue left behind was a note wedged in his desk drawer, written in delicate cursive. Accuracy doesn't protect you. It only delays the inevitable. The audit that never happened. As pressure mounted, federal investigators from the controller of the currency arrived in March. They found a system in disarray. Hundreds of unreconciled transactions. Missing payment logs. Inconsistent deposit records. But most baffling was this. No one at the bank had attempted a single full audit since 1965. Ellis Wentz insisted it was due to paperwork backlogs and staff reduction. But that explanation fell apart when an internal memo surfaced signed by Wentz canceling a scheduled third-party audit in December 1966. The reason given: redundancy. All records already reconciled manually by D. Lane. Lane, it seemed, had become the only person capable of verifying the bank's most sensitive numbers. And now he was missing, so were the ledgers. And $1.2 million. Federal silence, local rumors. By May 1967, the case had ballooned into an embarrassment for regulatory agencies. Yet no arrests were made, no charges filed. A federal oversight committee declared the case a failure of protocol rather than a criminal act. The bank was quietly restructured. Wentz was asked to retire due to age. But in Aberdeen, rumors churned. That Lane had fled to Canada with a suitcase of bearer bonds. That Wentz had used the missing fund to cover gambling debts in Iowa. That a local sheriff had once seen Lane speaking with a stranger in an FDIC badge weeks before the disappearance. None of these rumors could be proven, but the town remembered. Especially because something still didn't add up. One ledger resurfaces. In 1973, 6 years after the incident, a demolition crew clearing out a condemned grain elevator on the eastern edge of town found a locked metal box inside a hidden wall compartment. Inside, one of the missing ledgers. pages 138 intact, pages 39-142 torn out. The initials DL, written faintly in the inside cover. The ledger contained notes for only 7 loans, all signed by borrowers who later denied ever taking out loans with the bank. This raised an alarming new theory. Had the entire program been a phantom? Had Wentz and Lane created loans on paper, fabricated payment trails, and simply erased them once money changed hands? Or just as disturbingly, had real people unknowingly paid money into loans that never existed, believing they were settling debts, when in fact, they were being defrauded? The silent collapse. In 1974, the Northern Plains Trust and Reserve quietly dissolved. It was absorbed by a regional bank. No statement was issued. No criminal inquiry reopened. Ellis Wentz died in 1978. Marjorie Rentz left Aberdeen in 1970, never to return. And Douglas Lane, never found, never confirmed dead, never heard from again. But the note he left behind remains, and it poses a question that has never been answered. Accuracy doesn't protect you. It only delays the inevitable. What was he warning about? And who, if anyone, was coming for him? By the summer of 1967, Aberdeen, South Dakota, had begun to return to normal, or at least something resembling it. The snow had melted, the sun dried the train tracks and sidewalks, and kids rode bicycles past the stone facade of the now quiet Northern Plains Trust and Reserve, as if it hadn't just experienced one of the strangest banking anomalies in American history. But inside police reports, federal documents, and a few locked drawers, the case of the missing ledgers remained an open wound. 6 accounting volumes, 1 vanished bookkeeper, $1.2 million in disappearing loan capital, no fingerprints, no forced entry, and perhaps most unsettling, no official determination of a crime. And yet, everything about it reeked of intent. The ledger room anomaly. Detective Neil Swickard, still working quietly on the case, grew increasingly obsessed with the architecture of the crime. He had walked the records room dozens of times, trying to find a flaw in the physical space that might have allowed anyone to remove 6 thick books without triggering attention. He noted something strange. The steel cabinet drawers that held the ledgers were designed with a key dual lock system, one internal, one external. According to maintenance logs, the internal lock mechanisms had been serviced in November 1966 by a private locksmith from Minneapolis named Gerald McNeary. Swickard contacted McNeary, who remembered the job vividly, not for the locks but for the client. "I didn't do the work for Wentz," he said. "I did it for a guy named Lane, said he was authorized, paid in cash." This suggested something bold and troubling. Douglas Lane had modified the locks himself, meaning he could access and remove the ledgers at any time without supervision. Swickard requested bank surveillance records, only to discover the camera pointed at the records room had been inoperative since September. A perfect blind spot. The phantom ledger sheet. In late June 1967, a former bank employee, Louise Minner, a retired loan officer, brought forward something she had forgotten in a personal folder. It was a loan summary sheet prepared by Lane, summarizing totals from the fourth quarter of 1966. This was important because one of the missing ledgers covered that exact period. The document showed a total disbursement of $416,000 across 22 accounts, yet none of these accounts existed in the bank's current system. No matching deposit slips, no repayment plans, no signatures. But what made Swickard's hands freeze was a strange symbol in the corner of the page. A faint watermark, like a triangle inside a circle, pressed into the paper. It wasn't a bank logo. It wasn't part of any known stationery. It was, as later discovered, the insignia of a private accounting firm that hadn't existed in over 2 decades. The Harrow Group. The watermark matched papers last used by the Harrow Group, a now-defunct auditing firm based out of Omaha. In 1948, the firm was dismantled after a federal investigation into fraudulent war bond reconciliations. 3 employees were jailed, the rest scattered. Among the former staff was a junior auditor named Calvin Lane, Douglas Lane's older brother. This changed the context of the case dramatically. What if Douglas hadn't acted alone? What if he had been taught to manipulate books, to create ghost accounts, and most dangerously to erase evidence with the precision of an insider? The use of Harrow Group stationery in 1967 was either nostalgic or intentional branding, a message meant for someone else. Swickard began to suspect the missing money hadn't simply disappeared. It had been recycled through a paper maze. The motel ledger. A break came in August when a local motel owner called the Aberdeen PD about a strange ledger found in one of the wall vents of room 6 during renovations. The motel, the Maple Arms, was a nondescript row of 12 rooms just off Highway 12. Inside the ledger, labeled Room Charges and Deposits, 1966-67, were 3 pages near the back with handwritten notes unrelated to lodging, loan amounts, names, payout dates, all listed in neat columns, with the initials DL scribbled at the bottom. One entry stood out. March 11/11, 45 a.m./10 cash confirmed/exit confirmed/recoded entry. The implication was staggering. Tenney likely referred to Earl Tenney, the farmer who had sworn he took out a loan. Exit confirmed suggested the transaction had been processed, then erased. Recoded entry hinted that Lane had overwritten the loan into another account or fabricated a new ledger line to bury it. The motel ledger was the closest thing to a confession, not that a court would accept it. Still, it offered one critical clue. Lane had been operating off-site, keeping shadow records, maybe even building an alternative ledger system for purposes unknown. The accountant's cabin. Armed with the motel ledger, Swickard expanded his radius of inquiry and began investigating rural properties that may have been used by Lane. A title record search revealed Lane had co-signed a private hunting cabin 40 miles west of Aberdeen, near Lake Pickerel, under the alias Daniel Locke. The deed was clean, no suspicion, no mention of financial activity. But when Swickard visited the site in late August, he found something strange. The cabin had no furniture, just a single desk. The walls were lined with blank ledger books not filled out but marked with labels, AD, EG, HJ, and so on. A tin lockbox under the floorboards contained carbon paper sheets, some still ink-stained. Most bore faint impressions of past entries, mostly numbers and dates. This was no retreat. It was a quiet bookkeeper's bunker. Lane had built himself a financial panic room. And then silence. By September 1967, the investigation stalled. No new sightings of Lane. No financial activity traced to the missing funds. Local leads dried up. The Federal Oversight Board closed the inquiry, stating that insufficient evidence exists to determine the nature of the loss. The bank's board issued refunds to customers with proof of repayment, but never acknowledged the criminal implications. $1.2 million was written off. Lane was marked as missing, presumed dead. No insurance payout was issued. And the ledgers, never found again. Legacy in red ink. Despite the lack of resolution, the Aberdeen case left a lasting mark on the banking world. New federal policy required dual custody for all physical ledger storage. Independent auditors were given legal immunity to report suspected internal fraud. A national archive of missing financial personnel was created. Douglas Lane was entry 4. In quiet corners of accounting forums and fraud examiner conferences, Lane's name is still mentioned, not as a thief, but as a ghost accountant, someone who vanished into the very thing he manipulated. The books, a footnote 12 years later. In 1979, a small financial institution in Bozeman, Montana flagged a strange transfer, $11,500 deposited in cash, then withdrawn 2 days later by a man in a hat and sunglasses. The transaction was routine except for the signature on the withdrawal slip. It read D. Lane. Was it him? Surveillance footage was overexposed. The man's identity couldn't be confirmed, but the handwriting was later examined by a retired analyst from the Aberdeen PD. Her conclusion: it was him, and he was mocking us. By the winter of 1968, the world had largely moved on. The war in Vietnam dominated headlines. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. America was focused on unrest, protests, and the moon landing to come. No one outside of Brown County, South Dakota, was still talking about the missing ledgers from a sleepy bank in Aberdeen. But for Detective Neil Swickard, the case remained personal. He kept a wall in his basement office lined with handwritten notes, grainy photographs, photocopied ledger fragments, and a pinned black and white portrait of Douglas Lane, the mild-mannered bookkeeper who had walked out of the Northern Plains Trust and Reserve and into a financial ghost story. And the closer Swickard looked, the stranger things became. Because slowly, he began to suspect Lane hadn't just escaped with money. He had rewritten history, the paper that shouldn't exist. In early 1968, a young bank clerk at Dakota Rural Credit Union, just a few blocks away from the defunct Trust and Reserve, accidentally filed a deposit slip under an old routing number that hadn't been used since the mid-1960s. The slip was rejected by the system, and as the clerk dug into it, she found the routing number still listed under a dormant institution, NPT and RINT, 2046. The number shouldn't have existed. The merger and closure of Northern Plains Trust and Reserve had officially retired all its routing numbers. The bank no longer legally existed. So where had the deposit gone? It took weeks to trace, but the funds had been quietly redirected into a holding account at a Denver-based subsidiary of a much larger banking conglomerate, an account titled simply Administrative Reserve Trust Lockbox 9332. No personal name attached, no known owner. But buried in the metadata of the account creation form, there was a placeholder field. DLREF. Only one man in this entire saga ever used those initials so deliberately. The Lockbox 9332 mystery. Swickard filed a request through the Federal Reserve to subpoena information on Lockbox 9332. The request was denied due to insufficient cause and lack of current criminal investigation. However, an anonymous tip later confirmed to have come from a retired Denver banking employee provided this chilling detail. That lockbox account had one recurring disbursement, $1,000 withdrawn in cash every 6 months at precisely 9:03 a.m. on the 14th of the month. The withdrawals were always made in person, always from different branches, always with different ID documentation, and always signed simply DL. But even more troubling was this. The withdrawals had started in April 1967 and were still occurring as recently as July 1977. Lane wasn't hiding, he was managing something. A whisper of the ledgers. In a 1972 university seminar on financial crimes at South Dakota State, an anonymous case study was presented by guest speaker Dr. Lillian Trent, a former consultant with the Office of the Controller of the Currency. She described a hypothetical fraud in which a single mid-level bank employee manipulated multiple overlapping loans, duplicated repayment schedules, and fabricated shadow ledgers. The goal, not to steal money in a single act, but to slowly bleed an institution while maintaining the illusion of solvency. Her final slide showed a blurred photo of a ledger entry with faint initials. Though the initials were fuzzy, anyone familiar with the Aberdeen case would have seen them clearly. DL. In red pencil. Dr. Trent refused to take questions after the lecture. An attempt to reopen. By 1975, Swickard had long since retired from the Aberdeen PD, but the mystery gnawed at him. He petitioned the South Dakota Attorney General's office to reopen the case based on the routing number anomaly and the Denver lockbox account. His request was denied. The reason: the statute of limitations for banking fraud at the time had expired. Without a named suspect, Lane had never been officially charged. No legal action could be taken. And even more infuriating, the missing ledgers, now classified as lost assets, were deemed not critical to the 1966-67 balance sheets due to the merger. The funds had been absorbed and settled through internal insurance adjustments. In short, the money was gone, the records were gone, and the system had quietly accepted it. One final lead. In 1982, Swickard received a letter postmarked from Spokane, Washington. No return address, no name. Inside was a single page, folded neatly, bearing only 2 sentences. No one noticed how many times I ran the same page. What you throw away is just as important as what you keep. Attached was a faded deposit slip dated December 1966 from Northern Plains Trust and Reserve. The amount, $11.52. The account number, 9AB132046. A familiar routing number. Swickard knew immediately this was Lane, or someone working on his behalf. He cross-checked the account. There was no record of it ever existing, but the paper, the ink, and the stamp were all verified as genuine. It was a message, not a confession, not a boast. A puzzle piece. A man who deleted himself. Douglas Lane didn't just embezzle money. He didn't just falsify records or escape into anonymity. He erased his financial fingerprint. Every move he made, from motel ledgers to cabin hideouts to old ledger books reclassified as miscellaneous, was about disruption of linear truth. In banking, every number is supposed to match. Every balance reconciles. Lane's genius, if one can call it that, was in understanding that the illusion of documentation was more powerful than the documentation itself. If no one knew where the ledgers ended and his fabrications began, then the entire history of the bank, its loans, its assets, even its debts, could be rewritten. He didn't just steal money. He rewrote time. Reflections in Dust. Detective Swickard passed away in 1990. His personal papers, donated to the South Dakota Historical Society, remain sealed under family request until 2035. But in his final notebook entry on the Lane case, he wrote, "If you hide in a place made of numbers, you don't need a gun. You just need a pen, a typewriter, and the patience to wait until everyone else stops looking. The most dangerous criminals don't erase you. They erase the evidence that you ever existed." Story 4. The Soapbox Swindle, London's Market Scam, 1908. In the narrow, soot-stained alleys of Whitechapel, London, the year was 1908, and the air carried the mingled smells of coal smoke, horse manure, and for a brief few months lavender and lemon verbena. This unexpected fragrance didn't come from a flower stall or perfume merchant. It wafted from wooden carts, pushed by sharply dressed men with waxed mustaches and top hats slightly too shiny for their station. They claimed to be selling luxury French soap at liquidation prices. Some even waved official-looking papers bearing broken French and half-legible royal seals. Each cart bore the same sign: Imperial Marseille Soap, direct from the Paris Exposition. The soap came in delicate cardboard boxes, wrapped in gold foil and stamped with fleur-de-lis. Women lined up in the market squares of East London, drawn in by both the smell and the spectacle. But what no one knew, at least not right away, was that the soap didn't come from France. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even made with proper ingredients. What these carts peddled was the product of one of the most coordinated confidence schemes in Edwardian England, one so elegantly simple it remained hidden for nearly a year. The mastermind in the crowd. He called himself Claude Bellamy. To the customers, he was an eccentric gentleman with a French accent badly faked, a white linen coat, and a silver walking cane shaped like a serpent. Bellamy gave impromptu speeches on hygiene, quoted supposed letters from Queen Alexandra praising the soap, and once even staged a letter of commendation from the French embassy. But Claude Bellamy didn't exist. His real name was Alfred Bristow, a failed stage actor turned grifter, who'd spent most of his adult life dabbling in short cons across the English countryside, fortune-telling, spiritual readings, false repairs, and even counterfeit genealogy reports for aging aristocrats. In 1907, after serving a brief stint in prison for mail fraud, Bristow had a revelation. The best lies are wrapped in truth and scented in luxury. He realized he could sell illusion, not in whispers or con artistry, but in bulk. The soap that was. The product that Bristow labeled as Imperial Marseille Soap was, in fact, made in a rundown shed near Camberwell by two of his associates, Jasper Cutts and Eldon Elbow Reeve. It was a mixture of rendered tallow from discarded meat trimmings, cheap lye, chalk powder end, a few drops of low-grade perfume oil sourced from a failing chemist's shop in Shoreditch. The result, a fragile soap that crumbled quickly, gave the illusion of fragrance, and left a slightly greasy residue on the skin. But it looked beautiful. Wrapped in foil, boxed with care, and stamped with a fake Parisian crest, the bars looked every bit the premium import. Each cart carried dozens, and the con relied on the performance more than the product. Only a shilling, madame. Bristow's crew was trained like a theatrical troupe. They had scripts. One played the French importer. Another posed as a testimonials writer, handing out fake customer reviews. A woman, always in a hat with a violet ribbon, pretended to be a duchess's maid, vouching for the product. They worked markets in Hackney, Stepney, and Limehouse, appearing suddenly, selling quickly, and vanishing before complaints could accumulate. They never stayed in one borough more than 2 days. To the authorities, it appeared to be an overstock liquidation. To customers, it seemed a bargain, and to Bristow and his gang it was money in pocket. The first crack. The scheme might have continued indefinitely, if not for an 11-year-old boy named Patrick Pip Mullen, who scraped together a shilling to buy a single bar for his mother. When she used it, she developed a rash so severe it left chemical burns. Their local doctor sent the soap to a laboratory, where it was discovered to contain highly impure sodium hydroxide and raw animal fat, but no trace of the olive oil or palm tallow found in real Marseille soap. The doctor submitted a complaint to the Board of Health, which was mostly ignored. Soap was not regulated at the time. But the complaint reached the desk of a customs officer named Frederick Pym, who had his own reason to take interest. A personal grudge. Pym had been working on smuggling investigations at London docks, and he recognized the name Claude Bellamy from a recent report. A crate labeled Fragrance Imports, Marseille, had cleared customs with forged documentation, and Bellamy had signed the entry. The address on the form was fake. Pym, sensing something beyond petty fraud, began tracing the paperwork trail, not of the soap itself, but of the permits, vendor licenses, and customs forms. What he uncovered was a fascinating pattern. All the documents were identical, same font, same margins, same misspelled word, aromatique rendered as aromatic. The forms, in essence, were copies reused and lightly altered. Pym sent one to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch with a note. The soap is likely harmless. The fraud is not. This is a commercial illusion on a grand scale. A network revealed. The Special Branch investigation that followed slowly unwrapped Bristow's operation like layers of foil around one of his counterfeit bars. Investigators discover a rent trail across 9 storage units under false names, receipts for perfume oil bought in bulk using various aliases, and a single bank account in the name of C. Bellamy that had received over £1,200 in less than 3 months, a fortune at the time. They also discovered something else. Bristow's team wasn't just selling soap. They were simultaneously running a parallel scam, selling exclusive import rights to the soap to small shopkeepers in Yorkshire and Kent, promising them crates of product that never arrived. In essence, he was running 2 scams at once. One to fleece the public with soap, the other to fleece vendors with fake wholesale contracts. It was brilliantly unethical. The arrest that almost was. In December of 1908, Bristow was finally tracked down to a boarding house near Clerkenwell, living under the name Mr. Henry Chalmers. But when police arrived, he had already fled. He left behind a crate of unsold soap bars, a letter to Elbow Reeve detailing new packaging plans, and a copy of a stage play titled The Sincerity of Soap. It took another 6 weeks to find him in Brighton, posing as a retired chemist. He was arrested on January 19, 1909, not for soap fraud, but for fraudulent representation in commercial licensing, a legal loophole that carried a heavier penalty. When questioned, Bristow smiled and reportedly said, "It's not a crime to sell optimism, only to leave a paper trail." The question that remained. At trial, Bristow was charged with falsification of trade documentation, intent to defraud, and reckless endangerment due to the caustic nature of the soap. He was sentenced to 3 years in Wormhood Scrubs. But here the odd part. The soap didn't vanish. New carts appeared in Manchester and Liverpool in the months following his arrest, selling the same product, using different names, meaning someone else had picked up the business. Or maybe he had never acted alone. To this day, no one knows what happened to Jasper Cutts or Elbow Reeve. They were never caught, and the counterfeit soap. Some say bars still turn up in antique shops, wrapped in that strange gold foil, brittle and faintly lemon-scented even after all these years. And when you unwrap one, you might still wonder how much of what we buy is real, and how much is just well-packaged belief. Story 5. The Phantom of the Freight Trains, 1944. In the early months of 1944, as the United States mobilized every arm of its economy toward the war effort, freight trains became lifelines carrying munitions, grain, steel, and fuel across the vast web of American rails. In the Midwest, the Union Freight Lines, based out of Terre Haute, Indiana, operated nearly 200 trains a week, many running overnight, unmarked, and unscheduled to avoid sabotage or theft. It was wartime. Security was high. Every yard had military police, plainclothes agents, and nightwatchmen trained to be suspicious of everyone. And yet for 8 months straight, freight manifests consistently came up short. Fuel drums would vanish mid-route. Crates of copper wire never arrived. Boxes full of machine parts sealed and weighed reached their destination half empty. No broken seals. No witnesses. No explanation. Whispers started among rail workers, growing into fearful jokes. They called him the Phantom, and he was bleeding the war machine. one train car at a time. A ghost in the roster. The first to notice a real pattern was Ernest "Ernie" Dahlin, a freight supervisor at the Decatur yards. He had served in the Great War and trusted paperwork over instinct. For weeks, Ernie kept returning to the same anomaly. Crates loaded with 600 pounds of brake pads out of Peoria arrived in Cincinnati weighing just under 540. The missing 60 pounds couldn't be explained by shifting load or steel shrinkage. But when Ernie filed discrepancy reports, they were quietly dismissed. Probably clerical error, they said. Wartime stress, they said. But then Ernie did something others didn't. He walked the cars himself. One night in May 1944, after a freight train pulled in late from Chicago, he checked the undercarriages by lantern light and found something deeply unusual. The floor bolts on one car had been unscrewed and loosely rethreaded. Someone had been inside the container, from below. He didn't report it, not yet, he needed more. Boxcar number 19,743. Later that month, Dahlin tagged a specific car number 19,743 with a hidden marking, a thumbprint of axle grease beneath the door handle. He arranged for it to be loaded with low-value materials, but marked it as carrying radio vacuum tubes, a product heavily targeted in black market rings. The car left Terre Haute at 3:25 a.m. headed for Columbus, Ohio. It arrived 13 hours later. The grease mark, gone, but the floor bolts had again been tampered with. Inside, 3 boxes had been opened and resealed. Ernie opened one and found something chilling, a glass Coke bottle filled with urine, carefully corked. A human had been living between the crates, somehow avoiding detection through multiple inspections. The Phantom wasn't just stealing. He was riding with the trains. Official recognition. Ernie finally went to Railway Police Inspector Lawrence Ebbing, who oversaw Midwestern wartime cargo security. Ebbing, initially dismissive, changed his tone when shown the floor bolt photos and the crate bottle. He looped in the Office of Defense Transportation, ODT. Within days, the Phantom was classified as a Class III security threat, the same level used for suspected domestic saboteurs. But what puzzled investigators most wasn't the theft. It was the surgical precision of the operations. No broken locks, no pried doors, no discarded packing material. And the total amount stolen across all incidents, nearly $400,000 worth of war material in under a year, meant the Phantom wasn't working alone. The fear grew. Was this a German saboteur? Or worse, an American traitor? The switchman's testimony. A critical lead came from a switchman named Wiley Groff, working nights near Kankakee, Illinois. Groff claimed to have seen a figure leap from a moving freight car into a patch of pine near a sidetrack junction. The figure was small, nimble, wearing what appeared to be a yardman's coat but with no visible insignia. When Groff shouted, the figure vanished into the trees. When they searched the area, they found a half-eaten tin of beans, a coil of stripped copper wire, and a torn canvas bag stenciled faintly with U.S. Signal Corps, 1942. It was confirmed the Phantom wasn't just stealing. He was repurposing military supplies, perhaps reselling them or stockpiling them. But for what? The Phantom's methods. Analysis of manifests and load weights across 4 states led to the creation of a profile. Targets, low security, night-run cars with valuable materials hidden among less desirable freight. Timing, always struck within 60-90 minutes of departure. Entry likely through underfloor paneling, loosened in advance. Exit near unmonitored sidings or in transition yards where inspections were rushed. But the most disturbing insight came from a pattern that emerged in August 1944. The Phantom never hit the same route twice, except when he did. On 2 occasions, the Phantom returned to previously hit trains, stealing different materials but leaving notes. One note scribbled in pencil on crate wood simply read, "Try harder." Another, found inside an ammo crate left untouched, said, "Not this one, dangerous." That message, left in a crate containing detonator caps, likely saved several workers' lives. Whoever the Phantom was, he understood the freight contents intimately. He was no amateur, no drifter. This was an expert in logistics. A suspect emerges. An internal audit of former rail employees uncovered the name Milton Tare, a disgraced yard foreman fired in 1941 for siphoning diesel fuel. Tare had vanished after his dismissal and was rumored to be squatting near the old McCook Junction, an abandoned maintenance stop. More intriguing, Tare had served briefly in the Army Quartermaster Corps, with basic training in crate packing, manifest systems, and weight load protocols. A search of the McCook yard turned up nothing. But tucked into the corner of an old signal tower, someone had etched the words, "Dead men can't ride trains, but ghosts can." Below it, a drawing of a freight car. Car number 19,743. The disappearance. On September 2, 1944, a special ghost train was run carrying only dummy crates, rigged with die packs and trip wires. It was manned by undercover federal agents. The train departed from Springfield, Illinois at 2:10 a.m. It never made it to its destination. At 6:32 a.m., the train was discovered abandoned and intact at the wrong yard, 40 miles east of the expected stop. The agents on board, unharmed but confused. None had seen or heard anything. But inside the last boxcar, written in chalk on the wall, was a message. "Nice try, wrong bait." And on a hook near the door, a railway coat, empty sleeves, no name tag. A war ending, a mystery lingering. By the time WWII ended in 1945, the Phantom attacks ceased. No more losses, no more missing cargo, no more sightings. The ODT closed its investigation in 1946, declaring the losses likely internal sabotage by multiple unknown actors. But rail workers had a different opinion. They said it was one man. A ghost, a rail spirit, a man who had mastered the schedule, the shadows, and the silence between departures. To this day, older railmen still speak of him when boxcars show up lighter than expected, or a shipment disappears inexplicably. They say, he's still out there somewhere, between the cars, riding the rails like smoke on the wind. By the autumn of 1944, the internal investigation into the mysterious thefts plaguing the Union freight lines had reached a standstill. The federal sting operation had failed. Surveillance teams were fooled. No agents were harmed, but they were embarrassed and, above all, outplayed. The so-called Phantom had become something more than a wartime nuisance. He had become a legend, one that freight workers both feared and quietly respected. But beneath the growing folklore was a deeper truth. Someone was orchestrating theft on a scale that required planning, knowledge, and time. And time was running out. The disappearing sightings. Investigators returned to the basics: where and how the thefts occurred. When analyzing the train logs, a peculiar pattern emerged. Every shipment that had been tampered with had passed through specific siding: small, often unmanned sections of track used for switching or resting trains. These sidings were rarely inspected, and many were not listed on official schedules, used only by veteran conductors who knew the lines intimately. One such siding was near Green Junction, just outside Litchfield, Illinois. It was flanked by tall wheat fields and an abandoned water tower, a place where you could, if you needed, step off a train unseen. Agents scoured the area and found something strange beneath the tower. Freshly overturned earth, a coil of military-grade copper cable, and a lantern marked with the initials MT. Milton Tare. He had been here, but the deeper question remained. Why copper? Why these specific items? The recycled manifest. Back in Tarot, Ernie Dolan continued poring over freight manifests specifically, duplicate copies from earlier in the year. His goal, find out if any items had disappeared, then reappeared on later trains. He struck gold. A set of boxes listed as MISC Tech Surplus Unallocated had disappeared from train 8742 in June. 3 months later, identical items with identical crate IDs were logged again, this time routed to an Army depot in Iowa. They had been repackaged, relabeled, and reintroduced into the war supply chain. Whoever the Phantom was, he wasn't just stealing for personal gain. He was moving goods as if running a black market logistics network parallel to the legitimate one. This meant he had a destination, he had clients, and he was using the very system designed to fight the war to quietly feed another machine. The Galesburg confession. Then came a break. A man named Louis Crum, recently arrested for transporting unmarked military equipment in the back of a produce truck, made a startling claim. He said he didn't steal the goods. He bought them from a man near the Galesburg rail yard who went by the name Mr. Barrett. Crum described Barrett as short, pale, with an old railroad coat, and eyes that didn't blink when you lied to him. Barrett had sold him 14 crates of copper wire, 2 crates of spark plugs, and several jerry cans of diesel, all for a fraction of market value. When shown a photo of Milton Tare, Crum nodded slowly. Could have been him, maybe not. I don't think he cared who he was anymore, just that he kept moving. Crum's story lined up with another theory investigators were beginning to whisper. The Phantom was operating a war effort shadow economy. And not to sabotage, but to redistribute. Not a saboteur, a ghost quartermaster. At this point, 2 schools of thought emerged. Federal agents believed the Phantom was a profiteer or saboteur, bleeding America during its most vulnerable moment. Rail investigators and some Army liaisons began to suggest something far stranger. That the Phantom was intercepting lost or misrouted cargo and ensuring it reached units or civilians underserved by the military's bloated bureaucracy. Supporting this idea were letters discovered in a crate misdelivered to Fort Wayne. Among them was one addressed to MT from a recipient in Omaha, thanking him for getting the cables through and statting, cryptically, "If the requisitions can't keep up with the rifles, at least the ghost can." The Army never acknowledged the letter's origin, but handwriting experts suggested it was real and likely from someone stationed at a forward depot. The train that shouldn't have run. On October 9, 1944, a night freight left the Tare Oat yards unscheduled. It was logged only in pencil, on a clipboard later found discarded in a yard shed. The train moved east along the Illinois Central line, stopping briefly at Decatur, Danville, Logansport. No known engineer ever reported driving it. No destination was filed. Yet, 3 independent rail workers at separate locations logged it in their journals as passing through dark, quiet, slow-moving, and without a caboose. It was dubbed the ghost train. When it vanished from the logs, so too did several previously missing shipments including oil drums, spark plugs, and wiring crates last seen 3 weeks prior in Omaha. Ernie Dolan was certain. He's not just stealing. He's running an alternate delivery system, one more efficient than ours. The final sighting. On October 21, 1944, a train arriving in Evansville, Indiana, had an unexpected passenger, an elderly brakeman named Oscar Miltner. unconscious but alive in a grain car. When revived, he claimed he'd been jumped while walking the yard near Effingham, stuffed into the car, and left with only a blanket and a flask of water. He said his attacker wasn't aggressive, just deliberate. Told me not to panic, said, "This train's full of holes, I'm just patching some up." Then he disappeared into the engine line. Miltner's description matched Milton Tare, but again there was no proof, no fingerprints, no hard evidence. And then the sighting stopped. The phantom disappears. After October 1944, no more freight discrepancies matched the phantom's MO. The war ended the following year. The Union freight lines continued under new management. Investigations were buried beneath paperwork. Officially, the thefts were attributed to unidentified wartime shrinkage, and Tare was declared presumed dead. But in some yards his name is still spoken, quietly. Not with fear, but with a strange kind of reverence. The man who perhaps wasn't stealing for greed, but redirecting a machine too big to fix from the inside. The man investigators believed to be Milton Tare, the presumed phantom, vanished after the fall of 1944. But the material trail he left behind didn't end so easily. In fact, the further law enforcement and military logistics officers dug, the more they began to realize just how deep and structured his ghost operation had been. This wasn't the story of a lone thief with a crowbar and a flashlight. This was a network operated by someone who understood the limitations of the wartime system and who may have weaponized that knowledge to fill in its gaps. The freight yards may have forgotten him, but some military units never did. The Midwest Circuit. After the final string of thefts in October 1944, a joint audit between the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and the Office of Defense Transportation uncovered something striking. At least 9 shipments that had been declared lost or delayed in the official system later reappeared accurately and intact at destinations weeks or even months after they had been marked irretrievable. Examples included a crate of clutch gears delivered to a tank depot in Kentucky, signed for by a soldier who swore he never requisitioned them but was glad they showed up. 20 barrels of aviation oil, delivered without paperwork to an airfield in Kansas, just days before a critical training operation. A delivery of tent repair kits to a remote Colorado Army installation that had sent multiple requests, but had been ignored by Central Command. No driver ever signed for the deliveries. No rail logs documented the arrivals. But each crate bore one unusual detail: a chalk T inside a circle. The chalk mark. The chalk T was subtle, faint, but consistent. A few investigators dismissed it as coincidence or graffiti from some earlier inventory system. But to Ernie Dolan, who had been chasing the phantom since spring, it was a signature. Every recovered shipment marked with the T had missing or manipulated manifests, unlisted transfer yard notations, and often more accurate routing than the original order. One ODT auditor, writing in frustration, remarked in the margins, "If only we could all be this efficient." This led to a radical theory, one that never made it into any official report. What if the phantom didn't steal shipments? What if he rerouted them, correcting the bureaucracy's own failures? The veteran's letter. In 1961, long after the war, a letter was sent to the Illinois Railroad Historical Society, addressed simply, "To whoever still remembers 1944." The author was Clarence Yancey, a retired Army mechanic who had served at a munitions depot near Des Moines. He wrote about a time in late '44 when their tools never came, their tents were full of holes, and their vehicles sat immobile. Until one day, a rail car arrived with no paperwork, no assigned crew, and no escort. Inside were the tools, the tarps, and just enough spare parts to get their unit moving again. There was no label on the car, Yancey wrote. Just a symbol on the floor, drawn in dust, a capital T inside a circle. We called it the Tear Train. Didn't know who sent it. Didn't ask. Just got back to work. The letter ended with a final line. If that man was a thief, he stole from the cracks we couldn't fill. An unlisted death. In 1974, a man named Martin Graber passed away in a small Indiana town under a false identity. His occupation was listed as retired yard worker. He had no family, no funeral, no known employment records. His birth certificate had been reissued in 1945, just after the phantom vanished. A local coroner, curious about the man's quiet life, found 2 items in a wooden box beneath the bed. A pair of steel railway gloves, and a railroad lantern with the initials MT, barely visible beneath a film of oil and soot. Graber was cremated. The items were discarded. But the coroner's assistant, who had once worked on the railways himself, kept a record. He had the hands of someone who worked with metal, not paper, he said. But he also had a notebook filled with schedules, old freight maps, stuff that hadn't been used in 30 years. When shown an old photo of Milton Tear, the assistant said, if it wasn't him, it was his ghost. What he left behind. What remains of the phantom's crimes or contributions is mostly paperwork and anecdote. He was never formally charged. His name never made the papers. His legacy never reached Hollywood. But among railroad veterans, military quartermasters, and a handful of cold case investigators, the man known as the Phantom was quietly revered. Not because he stole, but because he understood. He understood that in a system as vast and impersonal as wartime logistics, there would be gaps. And that in those gaps, one determined man with knowledge of train schedules, yard routines, and wartime complacency could move an entire economy beneath the surface. Final reflections. In 1982, a panel of historians re-examining obscure wartime losses published a single footnote in a broader report on theft and sabotage. It is possible, though unconfirmed, that certain Midwestern rail irregularities between 1943 and 1944 were the work of an unidentified internal agent acting independently of either Axis sabotage or organized crime. Whoever it was, they operated at a level of detail and moral ambiguity that continues to puzzle and fascinate historians. And in a quiet rail museum in Illinois, tucked behind a shelf of weathered signal flags, sits a glass case containing a single item. A rail lantern with a small hand-drawn T inside a circle, etched into the metal base. The plaque reads, "In memory of the unknown rider. May your trains always run on time." Story 6. The Trial That Vanished, the Missing Court Tapes of 1971. In the spring of 1971, a quiet but strange legal proceeding took place in the small town of Glen Burnie, Maryland, a case involving alleged fraud, forged government contracts, and illicit political donations. It was a federal case, prosecuted under seal, yet open to public record. Or at least it should have been. By the end of that year, the court transcripts, all of them, were gone. Gone from the courthouse. Gone from the federal archives. Gone from local press coverage. No copies, no microfilm, no audio reels. What remained was a case number 471 FC082, and a handful of whispered recollections from those who had sat in the courtroom, sworn in as witnesses, or silently taking notes on benches worn thin by generations of shoes. This wasn't just a lost trial. It was, many would later say, a trial that was erased. The defendant, Preston Cavendish. Preston Charles Cavendish was not a household name in 1971, but he moved in the kinds of circles that whispered power. A native of Baltimore, Cavendish had built a fortune during the post-WWII boom by forming Precision Naval Solutions, a defense contracting firm that specialized in electronic calibration systems technology crucial for submarine and radar operations. By 1969, his company held $46 million in government contracts, despite never having publicly demonstrated a working prototype. An internal audit by the Department of Defense triggered the eventual criminal investigation. The audit uncovered duplicate invoices, falsified testing certification, a paper trail of shell corporations used to route payments, and most disturbingly, an anonymous memo flagged something else: evidence of unrecorded meetings with Maryland political officials, suspected bribery or campaign laundering, recommend federal inquiry. The memo, dated April 12, 1970, was signed only KM. The name of the whistleblower remains unknown. The mysterious indictment. In January 1971, Cavendish was indicted on charges of fraud, wire misrepresentation, and violations of the Federal Campaign Practices Act. But the indictment itself was sealed, and it remained sealed even after the arraignment. News coverage was minimal. The Baltimore Sun ran a 4-paragraph column on page 17. The Washington Post didn't mention it at all. Court schedules listed the trial as U.S. versus Cavendish, closed session, federal case 471 FC082. That same month, the U.S. District Court in Baltimore transferred the venue to Anne Arundel County, citing security concerns and administrative rebalancing. Few questioned this at the time, but those who did, mostly court clerks and legal assistants, would later remember the transfer as odd, even by Cold War bureaucratic standards. The trial begins and ends. The trial took place over 9 days in April 1971 in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Glen Burnie Courthouse. According to unofficial recollections from retired clerks and 2 now-deceased attorneys, the proceedings were heavily guarded by plainclothes federal officers, attended by less than a dozen observers, not covered by any accredited journalist. One of the few who claimed to be present was Gloria Meeks, then a 26-year-old stenographer assisting the official court reporter. In an interview from 1993, she recalled, "It was tense, I remember that, not loud, not dramatic, just clinical. Every word spoken seemed to hang in the air like it had weight." When asked about Cavendish himself, polite, composed, never raised his voice, like someone who knew every move before it happened. The trial ended without a verdict being publicly announced. In fact, no outcome was ever recorded in the Maryland case archives. And that was just the beginning of the erasure. The vanishing transcript. In 1972, when a young D.C. journalist named Patrick DeBellis submitted a Freedom of Information request for the Cavendish trial transcript, he received a letter stating, "No such transcript is available. The proceedings of Case 471 FC082 are not part of the federal court record." DeBellis visited the courthouse personally. He spoke to clerks who vaguely remembered the trial but offered no documentation. Microfilm from the courthouse archives, normally duplicated monthly, contained a reel with a 6-day gap, marked unavailable due to damage. The tape backups of the stenographer recordings, typically filed with the National Archives, were simply missing, according to the NARA intake log. Reel boxes 421-424, checked out 110971 by O. Haynes, DOJ, not returned. No employee by that name was ever located in the Department of Justice. And perhaps most disturbingly, the presiding judge for the case, Hun T. Wycliffe Harlan, retired shortly after the trial and moved to Canada. He never gave an interview about the Cavendish case. His family later claimed he suffered a nervous breakdown that spring. A vanished verdict. No prison record for Preston Cavendish exists. No fine. No settlement. No exoneration. Nothing. In fact, following the trial, he liquidated Precision Naval Solutions quietly and moved to a rural estate in Wyoming County, Pennsylvania. There he lived under a corporate trust, rarely seen, never interviewed. His death in 1998 was recorded under his full name, but no obituary ran. No estate sale. No heirs claimed his assets. It was as if the trial had been a ritual of silence, carried out in a courtroom, and then buried beneath legal dust and institutional forgetting. Theories of erasure. Over the years, those who chased the story to bellies, a handful of conspiracy-minded legal historians, and a small group of former court employees developed several theories about what had happened. One plea deal with deep restrictions. One theory suggests Cavendish struck a secret plea agreement with the government in exchange for undisclosed cooperation. Some suspect he may have had connections to off-the-books defense projects, possibly Cold War signal surveillance contracts. Two state secrets prevalent. Another theory holds that the case revealed details of classified military technology or intelligence operations, leading to an unprecedented sealing and destruction of public trial records. 3. Political compromise. The most persistent theory alleges that Cavendish had dirt on several Maryland state and federal politicians, and the trial's disappearance was the result of a bipartisan political cover-up, brokered at the federal level to prevent cascading fallout. There is no proof for any of these theories. But there is also no alternative explanation for why a high-profile federal fraud trial would be deleted from history, and why no formal entity has ever acknowledged doing so. A lingering mystery. In 2011, a box surfaced during renovations of the old Glen Burnie courthouse. It contained unused trial folders, a judge's bench nameplate, and a single yellowing note card, misfiled between pages of a 1973 real estate dispute. The card bore a handwritten note, initialed TWH, presumably Judge T. Wycliffe Harlan. Cavendish knows where the wires go. That's the problem. This is not a matter of law. It's a matter of continuity. I have signed the order. There was no indication of what order had been signed. No file number. No explanation. Only the date, April 17, 1971, the day after the trial supposedly ended. By the summer of 1972, the case of U.S. versus Cavendish had already become a legal ghost. There were no transcripts, no sentencing, no ruling published in the federal supplement or the district reporter, the volumes where legal precedent lives on. And yet people remembered. A handful of courthouse clerks, a few attorneys who'd been called in on short notice, a stenographer who claimed she saw a man in a government suit take the trial tapes from the archive room one evening. If not for their fragmented memories, the entire proceeding would have evaporated without a trace. But the problem with memory is that it fades and fades unevenly. What lingers are the questions, the implications, and in this case, the growing suspicion that the Cavendish trial was buried not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well in uncovering something that couldn't afford to be seen. The legal black hole. Attorney Diane Kroll, who had worked as a junior paralegal for the Department of Justice at the time, would later describe something strange about the internal handling of the case. In a 1987 law symposium at Georgetown, she said, "It was as if the case existed in a legal vacuum. I remember seeing references to motions, discovery requests, filings, orders, but never the documents themselves, like reading footnotes to a book that was never published." Kroll eventually tried to look up the docket years later. While researching sealed cases, and couldn't even locate the case number in DOJ's closed archives. Case 471, FC082, had become a number without a paper trail. When she filed a formal request through the DOJ's Office of Special Litigation, the reply came in a one-line letter. No responsive documents found under that index or control number. Signed only, R. Elston, Compliance Division. No one ever identified R. Elston. A strange witness reemerges. In 1976, local Maryland reporter Myra Jean Holcomb wrote a retrospective about lost trials and bureaucratic disappearances. In a back-page paragraph, she mentioned the Cavendish case and received a strange phone call 2 days later. The man wouldn't give his name, but claimed he had testified in the trial as a contractor hired by Precision Naval Solutions. He said he was asked to verify procurement specs for calibration consoles, and recalled that the questions from the prosecution were oddly narrow, focused only on a specific batch of invoices from a Navy requisition office in Dahlgren, Virginia. They didn't want the whole picture, he reportedly told Holcomb. They wanted to contain it, cut it down to something digestible. But there was more there, a lot more. When she asked him to go on the record, he refused. She never heard from him again. The phone number he left behind was traced to a deactivated line at the Department of Energy. The defense nobody remembers. One of the strangest aspects of the case is that no one remembers Cavendish's lawyer. Legal memory is long. Even minor court proceedings get archived. But when researchers and court officials were asked who represented Cavendish, no name ever surfaced. Gloria Meeks, the stenographer who later went public with her recollections, remembered this. I think he may have spoken for himself. That's what sticks in my mind. Not like shouting or anything, just he was confident, cold but polite. Like a man who wasn't defending himself, just buying time. She also recalled that one of the prosecution's exhibits was a series of schematic diagrams, rolled out on a table and covered with a sheet during most of the trial. The diagrams were shown only once on the fourth day. That was the only time the courtroom felt tense, like everyone was watching too closely or not closely enough. The judges retreat. Hun T. Wycliffe Harlan, the presiding judge, retired unexpectedly just weeks after the Cavendish trial, according to family letters later auctioned as part of an estate liquidation in Canada. Judge Harlan had suffered a profound psychological crisis. One letter, dated May 1971, was written to his younger brother. I can't preside over fiction. That's what it felt like, Walter. I wasn't asked to make a judgment. I was asked to observe a ceremony and stamp it. Another note, written in July, was more cryptic. They let him walk because walking was the condition. They didn't need punishment. They needed it to not happen publicly. The letter was unsigned but matched his handwriting. Harlan's decision to emigrate to British Columbia, purchase a remote cabin, and vanish from public view puzzled colleagues for decades. Some suspected guilt. Others whispered about threats. No formal statement about the Cavendish case ever came from Harlan again. The company that wasn't, Precision Naval Solutions, Cavendish's company, was formally dissolved in late 1971, but no bankruptcy proceedings ever occurred. Instead, its remaining assets valued at $17.4 million were quietly absorbed by a Delaware holding company named Autraxis Limited. Autraxis had no website, no physical office, just a single fax number and an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. Years later, that same entity was linked to a research contract at the MITRE Corporation, investigating signal jamming vulnerabilities in Cold War naval systems. Whether Cavendish maintained any interest in Autraxis remains unknown. but several records suggest his name appeared on classified security clearance transfer forms, authorizing access under a new ID code between 1972 and 1975. It's possible Cavendish didn't disappear. He was simply reabsorbed. The archival glitch. In 1999, a federal court records digitization effort flagged a data inconsistency. A batch of sealed case metadata, including case 471 FC082, had checksum errors. When auditors attempted to open the file, it appeared corrupted, but a brief inspection of the raw metadata uncovered a file header marker with the words REDACTED, as per NSC Directive 17A. This was unusual. The NSC, National Security Council, doesn't typically issue directives for court files unless national defense, covert operations, or state-level diplomatic fallout is involved. That such a directive could be tied to a fraud trial in Glen Burnie, Maryland, suggested something else. This was never about fraud, at least not entirely. The echoes of secrecy. In 2008, a retired naval intelligence analyst, Henry Liscombe, gave a private interview to a legal historian writing a book on federal suppression of public records. He was asked directly, did the government ever intentionally destroy trial evidence for reasons unrelated to national security? He answered carefully, I can't speak to that, but I can say this: there were instances when truth had an expiration date, when full exposure was incompatible with public continuity. When pressed further, he added, in 1971, certain people in certain circles had access to systems too fragile to explain, even in court. When asked if he had heard of Preston Cavendish, Liscombe paused. No, but if I had, I probably wouldn't remember. A final trace. In 2017, a file surfaced from an FOIA request unrelated to the Cavendish trial, part of a Department of Defense archive declassification. The file was an internal memo about an unnamed signal calibration discrepancy that had compromised several NATO undersea tests during 1968-1970. One handwritten note on the margin, unsigned, said, resolved by re-engineering delivered by PNS Precision Naval Solutions, but keep public separation. It's the only known government record associating PNS with live defense implementation. It may also explain why the trial was not simply sealed but removed. Because whatever Cavendish had built, sold, or reverse engineered, it may not have been just bogus contracts. It may have worked. By the early 1980s, the story of Preston Cavendish had become legal folklore in certain D.C. and Maryland circles. Law students whispered about a phantom case that had no verdict, no paper trail, and yet haunted legal researchers for decades. Archivists stumbled on redacted metadata. Old clerks spoke of trials that seemed scripted rather than argued. But beyond faded memories and cryptic notations, the greatest puzzle was simple. Why go to such lengths to erase a fraud trial, unless it wasn't just fraud? And more disturbingly, what was the court really used for during those 9 days in April 1971? The judge's final letter. In 1989, nearly 2 decades after Judge T. Wycliffe Harlan had disappeared into the Canadian woods, a letter was found in the attic of his family's former estate in Chesapeake Bay, discovered during remodeling by a new owner. It was addressed simply, to whom it will matter after it no longer matters. The letter, nearly 10 pages long, was handwritten in delicate cursive. In it, Harlan detailed his growing unease during the Cavendish proceedings. He wrote about strange behavior from federal observers who were not listed on the court roll, and a trial process that, in his words, progressed without adversarial friction, almost like both sides had been rehearsed, both prosecution and defense acting out a performance for a third, unseen audience. Harlan also wrote of a sealed chamber, meeting on the 6th day of the trial. No transcript was made, no recording device permitted. 3 men I had never met, one from the Navy, one from a civilian office I'd never heard of, and one who said nothing but passed me a folder with no identifying marks. Inside was a list of 23 names and the phrase, "Security compromised, internal corrective advised, no public chain." He ended the letter with a quiet confession. I didn't understand what I was signing, but I understood what it meant. This trial wasn't for justice. It was for containment. The man with no past. In 1998, after Cavendish's death, attempts were made by local historical societies and investigative journalists to trace his final years. But there were no interviews, no photos, no public sightings after 1973. A Wyoming County postal clerk did remember delivering mail to a property owned by a quiet man who never came to town. His name on the mailbox was C. Preston, a subtle inversion of his real name. According to property records, he purchased the estate via a Delaware trust. Utilities were registered to a generic management company. No medical records were found from the area. One strange item did stand out: a radio tower constructed on the edge of the property in 1982. Locals assumed it was for amateur radio, but one technician who examined it during a posthumous property assessment noted, this wasn't CB radio. It was tuned to something military grade, possibly VLF, very low frequency, used for undersea communication. The tower was dismantled quietly in 2001 by what the assessor described as a team in unmarked trucks. Redactions, gaps, and faded footnotes. Historians continued to dig through old procurement records, contract awards, and naval research logs from the late 60s and early 70s, but Cavendish's name seldom appeared. Except once, in a forgotten footnote within a Congressional Research Service report on military contracting anomalies, one line stood out. Ref. Contract C70493A, redirected via NSA Pre-Review 1970. Note involves P. Cavendish, private contractor, signal calibration. Classified post-appropriations. See Directive NSC 17A. That same directive, the one found embedded in corrupted metadata, appeared again. It was never publicly acknowledged, but it consistently marked the boundary between what could be traced and what had been intentionally buried. The theory that grew in silence. Eventually, the whisper network of legal historians, ex-military analysts, and obscure technology archivists developed a working theory. Cavendish was not just a contractor. He was a fixer of broken tech specifically, a specialist in micro-signal harmonics, a niche but critical component of undersea communications. In the late 1960s, as Cold War tensions pushed submarine deployments deeper and further, the Navy discovered its undersea communication protocols were vulnerable to environmental interference, foreign jamming, internal misalignment. Cavendish, who had once studied under a dismissed MIT physicist known for fringe work in subaudible resonance, apparently built a modular correction system, a black box, for recalibrating naval signals in real time. The government funded it. Then they buried it. And when internal audits revealed fraud in his company, whether real or manufactured, the trial was conducted not to prosecute him, but to seal all evidence of the technology he had built. Because if the details of how he did it became public, so too would the vulnerabilities of America's undersea defense grid. The courtroom blueprint. In 2015, a long-retired architect who helped design federal courtrooms in the 1960s donated several old blueprints to the National Building Museum. Among the drawings was a layout for Courtroom 3B, Glen Burnie Courthouse, 1969. It had a peculiar note. Include closed-loop relay access behind bench, private line, no public routing. Such configurations were not standard for courtrooms of that time, particularly in small jurisdictions. This raised the possibility that the courtroom had been outfitted specifically for this trial, with secure communications or audio monitoring built in. In essence, the space itself had been co-opted, used not for trial, but interrogation and containment. A system designed to forget. What makes the Cavendish trial so unsettling is not just its disappearance, but the fact that so many different systems colluded to erase it. The court's transcript system, stenographic and audio, the National Archives intake logs, the Department of Justice docketing index, the Federal Contract Registry, even the press, all blank, as if the entire case had been swallowed by a legal singularity. And yet, the absence itself becomes a form of evidence. The redacted headers, the overwritten microfilm, the judge's handwritten confession, the contractor who refused to go on record, the military technician who said, "It worked, and that was the problem," all point to a singular conclusion. The trial was real, the crime was real, but the truth behind it was something the system wasn't built to process. So the system chose to forget it altogether. Final reflections. In the final line of Judge Harlan's lost letter, he wrote, "Justice is the promise that we will face what we fear in the open." This was not justice. This was a decision to remain asleep. 50 years later, that sleep holds firm. Preston Cavendish remains a name without precedent. The technology he developed is unnamed in public paths, and the courtroom where his fate was decided no longer exists in any official floor plan. But the silence he left behind is too perfect to be accidental. In a justice system full of missteps, clerical errors, and lingering footnotes, only deliberate erasure leaves no trace. And so we ask once more, what else have we been told never happened simply because it was too real to acknowledge?